On October 20, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur wades ashore on the Philippine island of Leyte beside Filipino President Sergio Osmeña, fulfilling a promise made over 2 years earlier. For MacArthur, this moment carries profound personal and strategic significance. After the devastating Japanese invasion forced him to abandon the islands in March 1942, he had vowed to return, and now that promise was becoming reality. The scene that would become one of the most iconic images of the Pacific War almost didn't happen as planned. MacArthur had expected a proper landing craft to deliver him directly to dry sand, but logistical complications meant no boat was available at the shoreline. Initially furious at this oversight, MacArthur nevertheless seized the moment, striding purposefully through the knee-deep surf in his signature khaki uniform and sunglasses. U.S. media outlets eagerly published the dramatic images of the general trudging ashore, and the photographs quickly became powerful propaganda symbols of American resolve and the imminent liberation of the Philippines. While MacArthur takes those famous steps that will define his legacy, U.S. forces who had actually landed several hours before him are already pushing inland against surprisingly weak Japanese resistance. The initial landings have gone remarkably smoothly, with far fewer casualties than anticipated. From the beach itself, MacArthur delivers a radio broadcast that resonates across the Pacific and reaches into the homes of millions of Americans back home. His words are carefully chosen to inspire both the Filipino people suffering under occupation and the American public supporting the war effort. Speaking into the radio microphone with the sounds of distant artillery as his backdrop, MacArthur declares with characteristic eloquence and drama that the people of the Philippines should know he has returned. By the grace of Almighty God, he proclaims, American forces stand again on Philippine soil. Soil he describes as consecrated by the blood of both peoples. He pledges that American forces have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over Filipino daily lives and restoring, upon a foundation of indestructible strength, the liberties of the Filipino people. The broadcast is vintage MacArthur, blending religious imagery, appeals to shared sacrifice, and promises of liberation in a way that captures public imagination while also serving clear strategic objectives. However, despite the optimism of MacArthur's dramatic return and stirring words, the battle for the Philippines is far from over. In fact, it will prove to be one of the longest and most costly campaigns of the entire Pacific War. MacArthur initially expects to capture Leyte and its strategically valuable airfields relatively quickly, perhaps within a matter of weeks. His planning assumes that once Leyte is secured, U.S. forces can use it as a springboard to invade Luzon, the main Philippine island, and ultimately capture Manila and Clark Field, one of only 2 airfields in the entire Philippine archipelago suitable for accommodating heavy bombers. Although MacArthur's personal prestige is certainly a factor in his thinking, he also genuinely wants his Southwest Pacific Area Command to contribute more directly and substantially to operations against remaining Japanese positions throughout the Asia-Pacific theater. His vision includes the Philippines serving as a major base for exporting American air power throughout the region, supporting operations from the South China Sea to the approaches to the Japanese home islands themselves. But poor weather conditions and determined Japanese actions systematically ruin MacArthur's carefully laid plans for a swift campaign. The U.S. Sixth Army, commanded by the methodical and cautious General Walter Kruger, advances far more slowly than MacArthur desires or anticipates. Japanese aircraft contest American air superiority with surprising effectiveness, while Japanese reinforcements continue to land from other islands throughout the archipelago, steadily building up defensive strength. The Japanese commander coordinating the defense is General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who has recently arrived from Manchuria. Yamashita earned the nickname Tiger of Malaya for his stunning capture of Singapore in February 1942, one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Despite his fearsome reputation and proven tactical abilities, Yamashita is decidedly unenthusiastic about his new posting to the Philippines. Upon receiving his orders, he responds with fatalistic resignation, acknowledging that his assignment has finally come and observing that his going to the Philippines won't change the ultimate outcome of the war. He grimly concludes that it's simply his turn to die. This pessimism reflects Yamashita's realistic assessment of Japan's deteriorating strategic position by late 1944. Yamashita's original strategy calls for fighting the decisive battle on Luzon, where the terrain and logistics favor a prolonged defense, but his superiors in Tokyo pressure him to commit forces to defend Leyte instead. Bowing to this pressure despite his better judgment, Yamashita contests the rugged mountain areas of Leyte as Japanese reinforcements arrive from other islands throughout the archipelago, steadily building up defensive strength. For several weeks, the battle hangs in a difficult balance as American forces struggle through challenging terrain against an enemy that knows the ground intimately and fights with characteristic determination. By early December 1944, however, Japanese strength on Leyte is visibly waning under the relentless pressure of American attacks. A desperate Japanese airborne counterattack against U.S. airfields fails catastrophically, with most of the transport aircraft shot down before they can deliver their paratroopers. More significantly, a U.S. amphibious landing captures Yamashita's critical resupply port at Ormoc on Leyte's western coast, effectively cutting off Japanese forces from reinforcement and supply. With no viable way to continue effective resistance, Yamashita makes the difficult decision to retreat to Luzon with just 1,000 men, abandoning the remainder of his forces on Leyte to their fate. Roughly 20,000 Japanese troops remain scattered across Leyte's mountains and jungles, and these determined soldiers continue to harass U.S. troops for 4 more months in a grinding guerrilla campaign. Despite this ongoing resistance, MacArthur announces the island secure on Christmas Day, 1944, eager to demonstrate progress and maintain momentum toward Luzon. Among the few Japanese who eventually surrender, rather than fight to the death, is Private Saito, one of only 439 Japanese soldiers who ultimately give themselves up to American forces. Saito's reflections reveal the disillusionment felt by many ordinary Japanese soldiers by this late stage of the war. He laments that losing one's life in a war of this kind is truly regrettable and expresses hatred for the army hierarchy that is stronger than he can put into words. Saito feels compelled to survive and tell his story to the Japanese people, believing his soul will never rest otherwise. With remarkable clarity, he recognizes that the terrible things Japanese forces did in China are now being done to Japanese soldiers in return. He concludes that Japan will soon be defeated and confesses that from the very outset of the war, he never believed Japan could achieve victory. Such sentiments, though rarely expressed openly due to military discipline and cultural expectations, were likely shared by many Japanese soldiers who could see the war was lost but felt compelled to fight on regardless. The battle for Leyte requires significantly more troops and takes considerably longer than U.S. planners originally expected, but it does provide the essential jumping-off point for the assault on Luzon that MacArthur has been planning since his evacuation in 1942. On December 15th, U.S. forces execute an amphibious landing on Mindoro to establish additional air bases and logistical support for the upcoming Luzon operation. Shortly after the Mindoro landing, MacArthur makes an emotional journey to view Bataan and Corregidor from offshore, the sites of the devastating final U.S. defeat in the Philippines in early 1942. Standing on the deck of a naval vessel and gazing at the peninsula where American and Filipino forces made their last stand, MacArthur later describes feeling an indescribable sense of loss, sorrow, loneliness, and solemn consecration. For a man of MacArthur's theatrical nature and genuine emotional attachment to the Philippines, this moment of return carries profound personal meaning beyond its obvious strategic importance. Yamashita, having safely reached Luzon with the remnants of his Leyte force, takes a fatalistic and pragmatic view of defending Manila. He seriously considers declaring Manila an open city to spare it from destruction, just as MacArthur himself had done in December 1941 when Japanese forces approached the Philippine capital. Instead of concentrating his forces in an urban defense that will inevitably result in the city's destruction, Yamashita focuses his defensive strategy on the rugged northern mountains of Luzon, where the terrain favors defense and where his forces can prolong resistance for months or even years. Nevertheless, Luzon still holds roughly 260,000 Japanese troops organized into 3 separate commands. Many of these soldiers, however, are hastily armed non-combat personnel who lack proper infantry training, vehicles, and adequate communications equipment. These service troops, sailors, and airmen, pressed into ground combat roles, will fight with determination but lack the training and equipment of regular infantry formations. MacArthur, relying heavily on intelligence assessments that consistently underestimate Japanese strength throughout the Philippines campaign, believes the Japanese forces on Luzon are significantly weaker than they actually are. He orders Kruger to conduct what he envisions as a lightning campaign from the planned landing site at Lingayen Gulf, driving rapidly south toward Clark Field and then Manila. MacArthur bases this optimistic assessment largely by figures provided by his intelligence chief, Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, who claims there are only 152,000 Japanese troops on Luzon. This estimate proves to be dramatically wrong, underestimating Japanese strength by more than 100,000 men. Kruger, a more cautious and methodical commander than MacArthur, wants to conduct a carefully planned series of operations rather than a headlong rush toward Manila. He remains openly skeptical of Willoughby's estimates, having learned through bitter experience in previous campaigns that Japanese forces are usually stronger and more capable than intelligence assessments suggest. The Sixth Army lands at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, and much like the initial landings on Leyte, resistance at the beaches is surprisingly minimal. Yamashita has chosen not to contest the landing itself, preferring to preserve his forces for the attritional mountain campaign he envisions. Within just a few days, 150,000 U.S. troops are safely ashore and beginning to push inland. As they advance, they receive invaluable assistance from Filipino guerrillas who have maintained organized resistance throughout the Japanese occupation. These guerrillas act as scouts, providing detailed intelligence about Japanese positions and movements, and also serve as effective combat troops, conducting ambushes and securing flanking positions. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain and local conditions proves invaluable to American commanders planning their advances. As Kruger's forces move south from the beachhead, the biggest immediate threat comes not from ground combat, but from devastating kamikaze attacks on the invasion armada still offshore. Japanese suicide pilots inflict significant casualties on American naval forces, sinking and damaging dozens of vessels. However, after several days of intensive attacks, the kamikaze strikes abruptly diminish and then cease as Japanese air losses mount to unsustainable levels. The Japanese simply run out of aircraft and trained pilots capable of conducting these missions, providing American forces with the air superiority they need to continue operations. Kruger advances toward Manila far more cautiously than MacArthur desires, carefully securing his flanks and maintaining strong defensive positions. His caution is driven by legitimate concerns about a potential flanking attack from Japanese forces to his east and the possibility of being lured into an elaborate Japanese trap. The lack of strong initial resistance strikes some American officers as perplexing and potentially suspicious. One senior officer confides to his diary that he still cannot make up his mind whether the Japanese defensive strategy is being stupid or rather bright, uncertain whether the weak resistance indicates Japanese weakness or is part of some larger tactical scheme. MacArthur, increasingly frustrated with what he perceives as Kruger's excessive caution, continually pressures him to advance faster toward Manila. However, the terrain presents serious obstacles to any rapid advance, with engineers discovering 217 destroyed bridges along the route to Manila. Every one of these bridges must be rebuilt or bypassed, requiring significant engineering effort and time. While Kruger likely does overestimate Japanese ability to mount effective counterattacks against his advancing columns, his caution is not entirely justified given the uncertainties about Japanese strength and dispositions. As 6th Army closes on Clark Field and the nearby Fort Stotzenburg in late January, MacArthur prematurely announces these objectives as secure, a pattern of optimistic public statements that will continue throughout the campaign and cause considerable frustration among field commanders dealing with ongoing combat. Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold, commanding the 14th Corps, complains bitterly in his diary about MacArthur's premature announcement. He notes that Japanese forces still hold Stotzenburg in considerable strength, even though General MacArthur has already publicly announced its capture. Griswold questions why MacArthur makes these premature declarations, which create unrealistic expectations and undermine the credibility of subsequent operational reports. In reality, it takes American forces 5 full days of hard fighting to actually capture the Clark Field complex, and a further 3 weeks of difficult operations to clear Japanese resistance from the surrounding area. The remaining Japanese defenders eventually withdraw into the mountains to join Yamashita's main force, having accomplished their mission of delaying the American advance. As American forces close on Manila from the north, the 37th Infantry Division and 1st Cavalry Division form 2 specially organized flying columns. These mechanized assault groups consist of truck-mounted infantry, tanks, and mobile artillery, all configured for rapid movement rather than sustained combat. Their orders are to bypass Japanese resistance wherever possible and rush for Manila, securing key objectives before the Japanese can fully prepare their defenses. Photographer Carl Maidans, who had himself been interned by the Japanese earlier in the war, rides with one of these columns and later describes the chaotic advance. He recalls that sometimes they rode on actual highways, and sometimes they bounced and trundled along in open fields and carabao trails. Almost all the bridges they encountered were destroyed, forcing the columns to ford rivers with men holding their weapons high and often wading up to their chests in the swift water, while the trucks and lumbering tanks pushed and pulled each other with engines screaming and water flying in all directions. In late January 1945, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army joins the battle, executing amphibious landings at San Antonio and Nasugbu south of Manila. The southern landing is officially designated as a reconnaissance in force, a limited operation intended primarily to gather intelligence rather than commit to a major advance. However, MacArthur gives Eichelberger private permission to push all the way to Manila if the opportunity presents itself. In a characteristic appeal to competitive spirit, MacArthur tells Eichelberger that this is his only chance to take part in the capture of Manila, encouraging him to become the Patton of the Pacific. This reference to Lieutenant General George S. Patton, whose Third Army is making headlines with its rapid advances in Europe, appeals to Eichelberger's desire for recognition and glory. The 11th Airborne Division advances aggressively northward from the southern landing beaches, moving with such speed and apparent strength that Japanese observers significantly overestimate American strength in this sector. On February 3rd, U.S. paratroopers execute a combat jump onto Tagaytay Ridge, which overlooks the main road to Manila from the south. The jump is conducted under difficult conditions, with only about 1/3 of the paratroopers landing on their designated drop zones. However, after regrouping with the crucial assistance of Filipino civilians who guide scattered paratroopers to their assembly areas, American forces secure the strategically important ridge by the end of the day. This achievement opens the road to Manila from the south and allows Eichelberger's forces to apply pressure on the Japanese from multiple directions. MacArthur's sense of urgency about reaching Manila is driven by more than just military considerations or personal ego. As U.S. forces advance across Luzon, they are moving toward numerous Japanese prisoner of war camps and civilian internment camps that have held military prisoners and civilian internees since the dark days of 1941 and 1942. Liberating these camps and their emaciated prisoners becomes a vital humanitarian priority, but U.S. forces must proceed carefully to avoid triggering Japanese reprisals against the prisoners. The recent atrocity on Palawan Island in December 1944 demonstrates the horrific potential for such reprisals. As American forces approached the Palawan prisoner of war camp, Japanese guards systematically murdered the prisoners, including burning many of them alive in air raid shelters where they had been ordered to take cover. The massacre leaves American commanders deeply concerned about the fate of prisoners in other camps as U.S. forces advance. In April 1942, following the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, the Japanese captured approximately 11,000 American and 60,000 Filipino military personnel. By late 1944, after more than 2 years of brutal captivity, around 7,000 U.S. prisoners of war remain in camps scattered across the Philippine archipelago. By January 1945, as U.S. forces close in on multiple camps, the Japanese begin removing many prisoners on so-called hell ships, cramped cargo vessels with horrific conditions that result in thousands of deaths during transport to Japan and other locations. The Japanese leave behind only the weakest prisoners, those deemed too sick or malnourished to survive the journey. Japan also maintains internment camps holding 7,800 Allied civilians, with over 3,000 concentrated at the Santo Tomas camp in Manila itself. These civilian internees include missionaries, business people, teachers, and families who were caught in the Philippines when war broke out. Conditions in all these camps are absolutely terrible, characterized by inadequate sanitation, systematic abuse, and slow starvation. Yamashita will later claim at his war crimes trial that he issued orders for prisoners to be humanely released as American forces approached, but such releases rarely, if ever, actually happen. In some cases, including at the large Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp, Japanese guards do tell prisoners they are free to leave, but simultaneously inform them that if they depart from the camp area, they will be considered guerrilla combatants and shot on sight. Faced with this impossible choice, most prisoners remain in their camps, hoping American forces will arrive before the Japanese guards decide to kill them. Opportunities to liberate camps do arise as American forces advance, and commanders prioritize these rescue missions despite the operational risks involved. U.S. Army Rangers, elite Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas liberate the Cabanatuan camp and its 500 surviving prisoners in a daring raid that becomes one of the most celebrated special operations of the Pacific War. The raiders carefully coordinate their assault, using a low-flying aircraft to distract Japanese guards while assault teams move into position. They then rush into the camp, killing the guards in a swift firefight, and begin the process of evacuating the prisoners. In many heartbreaking cases, prisoners are far too weak to walk on their own and must be carried by the raiders and guerrillas.
Some prisoners do not even recognize the Americans as friendly forces at first, so foreign are the new helmets, uniforms, and equipment that had been introduced since their capture in 1942. One ranger later recalls that he will never forget the bewildered look on the faces of these liberated men. The prisoners simply could not believe they had actually been released after years of captivity. The Rangers' equipment, including their helmets and weapons, was so completely foreign to prisoners who had last seen American forces in 1941 or 1942 that the emaciated men initially thought their rescuers might be men from Mars rather than fellow Americans. By early February, the flying columns racing toward Manila reached the city's northern outskirts and successfully liberated both the Bilibid prisoner of war camp and the much larger Santo Tomas civilian internment camp. At Santo Tomas, where over 3,000 civilians have been held in increasingly desperate conditions, U.S. officers find themselves in a tense standoff. The commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Hayashi, has taken 200 prisoners as hostages and threatens to kill them unless allowed to withdraw with his troops. After tense negotiations, American commanders agree to allow Hayashi and his men to leave peacefully. 8-year-old internee Rupert Wilkinson later recalls watching the guards' departure with mixed emotions. He remembers that some Santo Tomas residents jeered at the departing Japanese, but American GIs quickly shushed them, not wanting to provoke an incident that might endanger the hostages. The former jailers initially maintained good order for a few blocks, but once their American escorts turned back toward the campus, the former guards broke ranks and scattered in all directions, much to the mortification of Commandant Hayashi, who angrily tries but fails to rein them in. This chaotic departure reflects the broader collapse of Japanese military discipline as defeat becomes inevitable.
As the 37th Infantry Division and 1st Cavalry Division probe into Manila itself, MacArthur once again makes optimistic public statements about the imminent liberation of the city. He continues to hope that Manila can be captured largely intact, and his staff even begins preparing for an elaborate victory parade through the liberated streets. MacArthur envisions Manila being saved much as Paris had been saved by Allied forces in August 1944, with minimal destruction and maximum propaganda value. However, the fight for Manila will not proceed according to MacArthur's hopeful plans, nor will it follow Yamashita's strategy of abandoning the city. In early 1945, General Yamashita explicitly ordered Manila abandoned as part of his strategy of preserving forces for a prolonged defense in the northern mountains. However, Manila Naval Defense Force Commander Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi chooses to remain in the city with his naval forces, and historians continue to debate his exact motivations and whether he was following higher orders or acting independently. Some historians argue that Iwabuchi wants to fight to the death in Manila to redeem himself after losing his battleship command at the Battle of Cape Esperance in 1942, where his cruiser was sunk under him. Others suggest that he refuses to follow orders from an army general due to inter-service rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, which often reached absurd and destructive levels during the war. Still, other historians argue that Iwabuchi is simply unable to execute a withdrawal due to communication problems, lack of vehicles and transportation assets, and the time-consuming need to thoroughly destroy port and dock facilities to deny their use to American forces. Regardless of his original intentions, Iwabuchi makes the fateful decision to prepare Manila for a desperate last-ditch defense. Iwabuchi commands approximately 12,500 naval personnel and 4,000 army troops remaining in Manila. Most of these men lack significant combat experience as infantry, being primarily sailors, aviation personnel, and service troops. However, they are remarkably well equipped for urban combat, possessing large quantities of munitions, artillery pieces, and automatic weapons that have been stripped from damaged or destroyed aircraft and warships. Iwabuchi concentrates his defensive preparations primarily south of the Pasig River, which divides Manila, because he originally believed American forces would attack primarily from the south. Throughout the city center, Japanese troops systematically reinforce selected buildings that offer strong defensive positions, including the imposing Rizal Memorial Stadium, the substantial post office, City Hall, the Provisor Island power plant, and several earthquake-resistant government buildings and hotels whose reinforced concrete construction makes them ideal fortresses. Japanese defenders also prepare major intersections for defense, constructing camouflaged pillboxes armed with naval mines rigged as improvised explosive devices, automatic weapons, and substantial obstacles designed to channel American armor into kill zones. Within the buildings selected for defense, Japanese troops construct elaborate hardpoints using furniture, rubble, and materials torn from the buildings themselves. These fortifications include crenellated barricades specifically designed with openings for throwing grenades at approaching American infantry. Local residents like Pasita Pestaño Jacinto watch these ominous preparations with growing dread, recognizing that a terrible battle is approaching. She later recalls thinking that defeat is a bitter pill that the Japanese cannot swallow, and that defeat is the one thing that can transform them into beasts capable of unimaginable cruelty. As U.S. forces approach Manila's outskirts, Japanese troops begin systematically torching entire districts of the city and committing increasingly horrific atrocities against the Filipino civilian population. Under Iwabuchi's orders, or with his tacit approval, Japanese troops force thousands of civilians into public buildings under the false guise of providing them with shelter from the fighting. Once the civilians are confined in these buildings, Japanese soldiers attack them with grenades or burn them alive by setting the structures on fire and preventing escape. To justify this systematic slaughter to his own men and in official reports, Iwabuchi classifies virtually all Filipino civilians as guerrillas or guerrilla sympathizers, thereby making them legitimate military targets under the twisted logic of his orders. A Japanese diary captured after the battle reveals the systematic nature of these atrocities in chilling detail. The diary records that on February 7, 1945, 150 guerrillas were disposed of that night, with the writer personally stabbing and killing 10 individuals. On February 9th, the diarist records burning 1,000 guerrillas to death. On February 13th, he notes that enemy tanks are lurking in the vicinity of Banzai Bridge, known to Americans as Jones Bridge, and that their attack preparation has been completed. While on guard duty at a guerrilla internment camp, he records that 10 guerrillas tried to escape and were stabbed to death, and that at 4 in the afternoon, all guerrillas in the camp were burned to death. The horrifying reality that becomes clear from survivor testimony and forensic evidence is that practically all those the Japanese systematically murder are normal civilians, including women, children, and elderly people with no connection whatsoever to guerrilla activities. Japanese troops commit atrocities of almost unimaginable cruelty, including bayoneting children in front of their horrified parents and routinely mutilating bodies after death in acts of pointless sadism. Japanese soldiers also systematically target young women for sexual violence, especially those with lighter complexions who are presumed to come from wealthy or educated families. Soldiers take these women to the Bayview Hotel and other locations where they are subjected to repeated gang rape over multiple days. Luisa Guevara is one of the women subjected to this nightmare, and she later testifies about her ordeal. She recalls that every night was exactly the same, with Japanese soldiers taking different girls throughout the night in a continuous cycle of abuse. She loses track of time and what is happening, existing in a state of trauma and believing that all the women are ultimately going to be killed once the soldiers tired of them. As U.S. forces approach Manila's outskirts, Lieutenant General Griswold's 14th Corps begins fighting through Manila's northern suburbs, making slow and costly progress against determined Japanese resistance. He requests substantial air support to help reduce Japanese strongpoints. However, MacArthur refuses to authorize bombing of the city, clinging to his hope of preserving Manila's infrastructure and historical buildings. He only reluctantly allows the use of artillery, and even then initially imposed significant restrictions. Griswold, who can see the situation on the ground and is receiving reports of Japanese atrocities and the systematic destruction they are inflicting, complains bitterly about MacArthur's unrealistic restrictions. In his diary, he writes that MacArthur has visions of saving this beautiful city intact, but does not realize that the skies burn red every night as the Japanese systematically sack and torch the city. He also doesn't understand that enemy rifle, machine gun, mortar, and artillery are steadily increasing in intensity as American forces push deeper into prepared Japanese defensive positions. Griswold's private opinion, which he confides to his diary, is that the Japanese will hold part of Manila south of the Pasig River until every last defender is killed, making MacArthur's hope of saving the city completely
While 6th Army grinds forward through northern Manila in brutal house-to-house fighting, the 11th Airborne Division makes important advances from the south. After successfully clearing Tagaytay Ridge, the paratroopers approach Iwabuchi's most strongly prepared defensive positions between Nichols Field and Fort McKinley, a fortified line that becomes known as the Genko Line. This defensive barrier consists of approximately 1,200 pillboxes and fortified buildings extending for 5.5 kilometers toward Manila. On Nichols Field itself, Japanese naval personnel have positioned numerous naval guns and anti-aircraft guns in ground rolls, including massive 120mm guns now employed in devastating anti-tank rolls. The 11th Airborne Division lacks the heavy weapons, armor, and artillery support necessary to break through such formidable prepared defenses, ending Eichelberger's hope of conducting a rapid drive into southern Manila. On February 10th, recognizing the stalemate, the 11th Airborne is transferred to 6th Army's operational control to provide better coordination and access to heavier artillery support. Meanwhile, the 1st Cavalry Division conducts a flanking movement around Manila to support the assault on Fort McKinley from a different direction. On February 13th, after days of costly fighting, U.S. troops finally capture Nichols Airfield, and American momentum in southern Manila begins to increase. 11th Airborne officer Edward Flanagan later reports on his division's entry into Manila, describing scenes of devastating destruction. He observes that houses and shops flanking both sides of the highway leading to the heart of the city have been torn apart by both Japanese and American artillery fire. Tin-roofed houses look as though a giant can opener has sliced through them, while once pretentious mansions now display only charred chimneys standing above trash piles of rubble. The Manila that American forces are liberating is already a shattered ruin, destroyed as much by Japanese demolitions and arson as by American firepower. By this point, the 37th Division fighting in northern Manila has captured the strategically important Provisor Island power plant after heavy fighting and has successfully crossed the Pasig River in assault boats, despite intense Japanese fire from the southern bank. American forces now effectively surround the remaining Japanese strongpoints concentrated in the government district and the historic 16th century Spanish walled city of Intranujos, the oldest district of Manila and a UNESCO World Heritage Site filled with irreplaceable historical buildings. U.S. forces, however, discover they are largely untrained and unprepared for the demands of urban combat. Manila's wide boulevards offer limited cover for advancing infantry, while reinforced concrete government buildings withstand even heavy bombardment. Through painful trial and error, U.S. troops develop improvised assault squad tactics specifically adapted to urban warfare. These teams typically consist of soldiers armed with flamethrowers, automatic riflemen providing suppressive fire, demolition specialists carrying satchel charges, and soldiers armed with bazookas for bunker busting. These specially organized teams develop techniques for saturating doors and windows with overwhelming fire before actually entering buildings, significantly reducing casualties among assault troops. According to the diary of a Japanese Navy lieutenant later recovered from his body, Admiral Iwabuchi orders his men to fight literally to the death, never surrendering regardless of circumstances. The orders specify that if they run out of bullets, they will use grenades. If they run out of grenades, they will cut down the enemy with their swords. And if their swords break, they will kill Americans by sinking their teeth deep into enemy throats. Such fanatical orders, while consistent with Japanese military culture, also reflect Iwabuchi's recognition that there is no possibility of survival or evacuation for his trapped forces. U.S. troops gradually clear Japanese strongpoints through a combination of overwhelming firepower and small unit assault tactics. They clear the Rizal Memorial Stadium in particularly heavy fighting, with both sides suffering significant casualties in the confined spaces. Elsewhere throughout the government district, heavy artillery pounds reinforced buildings from as little as 100 meters away in direct fire rolls. American gunners fire hundreds of 155mm shells at individual buildings, with some structures eventually collapsing entirely, while others develop breaches large enough for infantry to assault through. After 16 days of continuous brutal fighting throughout Manila, only the historic Intramuros district continues to hold out against American forces. U.S. commanders decide to mass virtually all available artillery for a final overwhelming assault on this last Japanese stronghold. American officers carefully study the massive walls of Intramuros, some dating back to the Spanish colonial period and constructed to withstand siege warfare. They identify the northern wall, which is protected by the river and therefore presumably less heavily defended, as the weakest point in the Japanese defensive perimeter. With walls measuring up to 6 meters thick in places, standard artillery bombardment proves insufficient to create breaches. U.S. artillerymen develop an innovative technique, firing unfused armor-piercing rounds that bury themselves deep into the masonry without exploding, then following up with fused high-explosive shells that detonate the embedded rounds from within the walls, creating internal fractures that eventually cause sections to collapse. On February 23rd, in one of the most intensive artillery bombardments of the entire Pacific War, U.S. guns fire 7,900 shells in a single hour at Intramuros. The bombardment is carefully coordinated with the assault plan, with different batteries assigned specific sections of wall to target. As the 129th Infantry Regiment crosses the Pasig River in assault boats, and the 145th Regiment advances on foot through breaches in the walls, American gunners switch to firing smoke shells into Japanese-occupied buildings to blind the defenders and mask the final assault. U.S. troops storm through the breaches created by the prolonged bombardment, fighting room to room and building to building against the remaining Japanese defenders. The surviving Japanese forces conduct a fighting withdrawal toward Fort Santiago, the final defensive position within Intramuros. Fearing unacceptable casualties in assaulting the fort's underground tunnels and bunkers, U.S. troops develop a horrific but effective tactic. They pump hundreds of gallons of gasoline into the tunnel entrances and then ignite it, creating massive fireballs that consume all the oxygen in the confined spaces. A report from the 37th Infantry Division describes the tactic's effectiveness with chilling matter-of-factness. The report states that every conceivable method was employed, including liberal use of gasoline and oil. When things finally cooled down sufficiently for men to enter these underground chambers, they found Japanese soldiers piled high, having suffered deaths just as horrible as they had inflicted on the thousands of innocent civilians they had massacred. The Japanese had been holding hostages in various locations within Fort Santiago, and as U.S. troops clear the fortress, they discover fresh evidence of atrocities that enrage the assault troops. They find rooms literally stacked with the bodies of bayoneted and shot victims, while other chambers contain the corpses of prisoners who were deliberately sealed in tunnels and left to starve to death in complete darkness. U.S. forces reduced the last significant Japanese resistance by nightfall on February 25th, although determined defenders in the Legislative Building, Agricultural Building, and Finance Building managed to hold out for another 5 days. Admiral Iwabuchi almost certainly commits suicide in the Agricultural Building on February 25th as American forces close in, though his body is never definitively identified among the hundreds of burned and mutilated corpses found in the building's ruins. On March 3, 1945, MacArthur officially announces Manila secure, though scattered Japanese holdouts continue to be discovered and killed for weeks afterward. The Battle of Manila, the largest and most destructive urban battle of the entire Pacific War, results in devastating losses for all sides. U.S. casualties total 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded, with almost half of these losses concentrated in the 37th Division, which bore the brunt of the fighting in northern Manila. Approximately 14,000 Japanese defenders are killed, making the battle a virtual annihilation of Iwabuchi's command, while about 3,000 Japanese managed to escape the city and make their way north to rejoin Yamashita's forces. The civilian losses are almost incomprehensible in their scale, with estimates suggesting approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians killed, representing roughly 10% of Manila's pre-battle population. One controversial post-war estimate suggests that 60% of these civilian deaths were directly caused by deliberate Japanese atrocities and massacres, while 40% resulted unintentionally from American artillery fire and aerial bombardment, though these specific statistics remain hotly debated by historians and survivors. MacArthur's hope of capturing Manila intact, preserving it as Paris had been preserved in Europe, proves completely unrealistic and perhaps reflected a failure to understand either Japanese intentions or the realities of urban warfare. The general laments the extraordinarily high civilian casualties, as well as the near-complete destruction of the city he had loved and called home for years before the war. In a moment revealing his priorities, MacArthur also specifically laments the destruction of his former luxury suite at the Manila Hotel, which had been his residence during his time as military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth. MacArthur's staff member, General Bonner Fellers, writes to his wife attempting to justify the destruction, explaining that the prolonged battle was caused by what he characterizes as a rather futile effort to save Manila and protect the civilian population. Fellers concludes his letter by suggesting that if anything should happen to Tokyo in the coming months, the Japanese will have asked for it through their own actions in Manila, essentially justifying potential destruction of Japanese cities as appropriate retaliation. Despite the fall of Manila, the Philippines campaign is far from over. General Yamashita continues to conduct his planned attritional defense from the northern mountains of Luzon, tying down substantial American forces that might otherwise be employed in operations closer to the Japanese home islands. Nevertheless, from the American strategic perspective, the Philippines operation must be considered a significant success by early March 1945. The legitimate Filipino government under President Sergio Osmeña has been restored in Manila. All major airfields suitable for heavy bomber operations have been captured and are being rapidly developed, and the bulk of organized Japanese combat forces in the islands have been destroyed or rendered ineffective. MacArthur continues extensive operations against Yamashita's mountain strongholds, increasingly employing Filipino guerrilla forces who fight as regular infantry alongside American units rather than in their traditional irregular role. These Filipino forces prove highly effective in the difficult mountain terrain they know intimately. By May 3, 1945, U.S. forces finally secure both Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, objectives of immense symbolic importance given their role in the devastating American defeat of 1942. For MacArthur personally, these victories helped fulfill his promise to return and avenge the earlier defeats. MacArthur authorizes and personally oversees additional amphibious landings on Palawan, Mindanao, and throughout the Visayan Islands, systematically extending American control throughout the Philippine archipelago. These operations continued to push Yamashita's remaining forces northward on Luzon toward the remote mountain town of Bontoc. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in these shrinking defensive perimeters, simple survival becomes a greater challenge than combat itself. Isolated from supply lines and unable to grow or obtain adequate food in the barren mountains, many Japanese troops face starvation. One Japanese soldier's diary captures the desperate extremes to which starving men resort, describing how an officer of another unit was eaten by his orderly as soon as he breathed his last. The diarist rationalizes this act of cannibalism by suggesting the officer was so devoted to his orderly that he bequeathed him his body as a final gift, and that this loyal servant fulfilled his final wishes by burying him in his belly instead of in the earth. Such accounts, while shocking, reflect the absolute desperation of Japanese forces cut off from all supply and facing slow death by starvation. Active fighting continues on Luzon right up until Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, making the Philippines one of the longest continuous battles in the Pacific theater. Yamashita eventually surrenders his remaining forces and is subsequently tried by an American military tribunal for his alleged role in the atrocities committed in Manila and throughout the Philippines. Although Yamashita argues at his trial that he never personally ordered reprisals against civilians, and in fact ordered Manila evacuated specifically to avoid civilian casualties, the military court holds him responsible under the doctrine of command responsibility for crimes committed by forces under his authority. The court sentences him to death by hanging, and he is executed on February 23, 1946. In his final written statement before execution, Yamashita acknowledges his fate with dignity and characteristic fatalism. He writes that the time has come for him to atone for his guilt with his death, but he does not believe that all the crimes for which he is held responsible can be easily liquidated simply by his execution. He acknowledges that various indelible stains that he left in the history of mankind cannot be offset by what he calls the mechanical termination of his life. Whether Yamashita personally bears moral responsibility for the Manila massacres remains controversial among historians, with many arguing that Admiral Iwabuchi acted independently and against Yamashita's explicit orders.
The totality of the Philippines campaign results in staggering casualties on all sides. American losses in the ground campaign total approximately 16,200 killed and 47,000 wounded, making it one of the costliest American campaigns of the Pacific War. Japanese casualty estimates vary considerably depending on methodology and sources, with the highest credible estimates claiming as many as 500,000 Japanese military personnel killed throughout the Philippines, the vast majority dying from disease and starvation rather than in actual combat. If accurate, this figure would constitute approximately 1/5 of all Japanese military deaths in the entire Pacific War, making the Philippines proportionally Japan's costliest defeat. The Filipino population suffers catastrophically, with approximately 1 million Filipino civilians killed during the war years and 33,000 guerrilla fighters killed in combat, with casualties spiking dramatically in the final months of Japanese occupation as discipline collapsed and atrocities multiplied.
The extremely high casualty figures and the prolonged nature of the campaign lead some historians to argue that the Philippines should have been bypassed entirely in favor of a more direct approach to the Japanese home islands. These critics point to the arguments made by Admiral Chester Nimitz and others before the campaign that the strategic objectives could be achieved by isolating the Philippines and capturing objectives further north. Other historians, focusing specifically on the Battle of Manila, suggest that MacArthur's ego and his unrealistic desire to capture Manila intact significantly drove up both military and civilian casualties. They criticize his refusal to authorize heavy air support and his initial restrictions on artillery, while simultaneously demanding rapid advances from commanders facing prepared defensive positions. These critics argue that MacArthur's contradictory demands put field commanders in an impossible situation that unnecessarily prolonged the battle and increased casualties. However, MacArthur's defenders highlight that his limitations on supporting fires came not from desires for personal prestige or glory, but from genuine and well-founded concerns for non-combatants. They point out that MacArthur was deeply concerned about the welfare of Filipino civilians who were American allies and friends suffering under brutal occupation. He was also acutely aware of the prisoner of war and civilian internment camps scattered throughout Manila and the surrounding areas, knowing that heavy bombardment might kill those he was trying to rescue. As historian John C. McManus observes in his book Fire and Fortitude, MacArthur viewed the Allied return to the Philippines as something akin to the rescue of a beloved family member, an almost mystical moment of redemption and fellowship between Americans and Filipinos. McManus notes that seldom in American military history has a commanding general felt such a profoundly messianic sense of mission and maintained so tight an emotional bond with the people he sought to liberate. This emotional investment, whatever its effects on operational decisions, was genuine rather than merely theatrical. Regardless of the debate over MacArthur's personal motivations and decision-making, the strategic importance of the Philippines campaign cannot be reasonably disputed. The Philippines served as a vital Japanese logistical hub, connecting the resource-rich southern territories with the Japanese home islands. The archipelago housed major airfields that could threaten American operations throughout the region. Perhaps most importantly, from both a political and moral standpoint, the Philippines constituted an allied government under enemy occupation, with the legitimate Commonwealth government in exile and millions of pro-American civilians suffering under increasingly brutal Japanese rule. With Manila captured and the Philippines substantially liberated, American forces now prepare to attack what will be the next and ultimately final targets, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which constitute actual Japanese sovereign territory rather than occupied Allied nations. The Battle of Manila stands as one of the relatively rare cases of major urban combat in the Pacific theater outside of the China front. The battle's intensity, duration, and devastating impact on the civilian population made it comparable in many ways to urban battles being fought simultaneously in Europe as the war reached its climax. While American forces were fighting their way through Manila's burning streets in February 1945, Soviet forces were preparing for their own massive urban assault on the capital of Nazi Germany, Berlin. If you enjoyed this detailed historical documentary, please take a moment to like this video, share it with anyone interested in World War II history, and leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions about the Philippines campaign. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth historical documentaries. We put tremendous research and effort into bringing you the most detailed and accurate accounts of these pivotal moments in history, and your support through likes, shares, and subscriptions helps us continue producing this content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.